Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night. I mean, good everything, as long as it's good. And welcome to the second lecture of the second edition of the Economy of Francesco School. I remind you the title of this edition of the school, Listening to Plans for a New Economic Paradigm. And today we will have Professor Denison, and he's gonna lecturing us on small-scale projects could make crop plans. I'm not going to introduce the lesson of Professor Denison. I'm here just on behalf of the organizing committee to say the most important thing, perhaps, and which is to express our gratitude to Professor Denison for having accepted our invitation, but also to Maria Virginia, Caterina, and Bernat, the young EOF people who will interact with Professor Denison, because you remember that the Economy of Francesco School is about keynote speaker, but also about discussion. So it lives on these two pillars. And two technical reminders, you will find on the YouTube description the link to the Spanish translation. So if you want to follow this lesson in Spanish, just go on the YouTube description, click there, and you will be redirected to another YouTube page in which you find the Spanish translation. And as always, the registration form, the link to the registration form will be shared on the YouTube chat. So just wait and we are gonna share the link. Now, my role, my time is over and I give the floor to Maria Virginia Solis-Wonish. Maria Virginia, she's from Argentina. She's co-founder and CEO of Matera. She's current coordinator of the Agriculture and Justice Village of the Economy of Francesco and co-leader of the Farm of Francesco. So basically, she cooperates, So Maria Virginia, I give you the floor to introduce Professor Denison and to moderate this topic. And thank you again to everyone.
Thank you, Paolo, Valentina, Lourdes, like all the EOF team for making this possible. And thank you also for all our EOF community that is joining today live from different countries, but also by watching this recording later after the session is over. And today, as Paolo was saying, we are starting the second session of the EOF school, the second edition, and we are learning from legumes with Professor Denison. We will have our first moment of the lesson, listening to the professor, and then we will have our EOF discussions. That is going to be Bernat and Caterina. And we also, as always, we welcome you to leave your comments and questions in the chat, so then we can provide our questions here to the professor and keep growing the discussion in this lesson. So today we are learning from legumes, and we are getting the second session that is entitled Small Scale Projects, How Could Make Crop Plants and Their Symbiotes More Cooperative. And in this time, in this global crisis, cooperation between sectors and groups of individuals is very important. The collective benefit of collaboration is very high. However, cooperating in a global crisis can be particularly costly for individuals because it requires overcoming the conflict between short-term self-interest and long-term collective interest, and also because of all the conflicting interests that can be between sectors and between individuals. In this process of the school, we are seeing and we are learning from legumes how legumes plants cooperate with bacteria, and how can legumes plant can get much of the nitrogen they need from bacteria that live inside the root nodules. And for this, I would like to introduce Professor Denison. Professor is the adjunct professor from the University of Minnesota. Much of his research has focused on symbiosis between legumes and the root nodules bacteria that supply them with nitrogen. He has published several papers explaining why the natural toxins plants make to defend themselves against insects can be beneficial to human health. He also co-invented devices to assess root nodules functions and to measure sunlight captured by field crops. He studied ecology at the Evergreen State College and earned a PhD in crop science from Cornell University. After his postdoctoral research at UC Davis and UCLA, he did lab and field research with USDA for several years before returning to UC Davis as a faculty member. There, he taught crop ecology and directed LTRAS, a 72-acre long-term experiment on agricultural sustainability and resource use efficiency. At the University of Minnesota, he's an adjunct professor in ecology and evolution, mostly mentoring students, and he's also a fellow in the College of Agriculture, advising Minnesota three-site long-term agricultural research network. So with this introduction, Professor, I give the floor to you. Thank you very much for joining today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction and agree about both the importance of cooperation and the challenges. I should be seeing a thing to share my screen. I'm not seeing that. That button has disappeared. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I will share my screen now. Is that showing up okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to try to convince some of you that small scale projects, but some of you might be involved in, could help to make crop plants and their symbionts more cooperative. And on the left is a strangler fig, which is killing its host tree. And that's symbolic of the conflicts that happen between plants. And on the right here are these root nodule bacteria that Maria mentioned that provide nitrogen to plants. So this is an example on the right of cooperation, but still with some opportunities for improvement. So here's a summary of my talk. A little bit first on competition among plants. Plants evolve to compete with each other, and that reduces benefits to the plant community and to the human communities that depend on crops for food. But I will argue that farmers can actually increase benefits from crops by reversing some of that past evolution that made plants too selfish and selecting for more cooperation among plants. And then my own area of research is mostly on symbiotic microbes, which can substitute for nitrogen fertilizers. And the success of this symbiosis actually depends on plants limiting the reproduction of cheaters, that is bacteria that are providing less benefit than others. And here again, I think that there's an opportunity for small scale projects to identify varieties, perhaps heirloom varieties, that could be even better at improving symbiont cooperation. And therefore, every year, you would be getting more benefits from symbiosis in agriculture. Well, let's start with competition among plants. And I'll use an example of solar tracking. The solar tracking is where leaves turn during the day to follow the sun. And this little alfalfa leaflet here is getting more light and photosynthesizing more because it's aiming right at the sun. But this leaflet here is photosynthesizing less because the leaf that's casting this shadow is tracking the sun. And because it's aiming right at the sun, it's making a bigger shadow. More of this leaf is shaded, and that's actually reducing photosynthesis. So the question is, what's the balance between these two things, the potential benefit of tracking the sun versus the potential cost? And to answer that question, quite a few years ago, I designed an experiment. This is sort of what I look like now, but that's actually my father. That's me. And designed an experiment where we could measure photosynthesis of a small community of plants. And we could either let them track the sun normally, or we could disrupt solar tracking by turning the system. And what we found here, the vertical axis is the benefit or cost of solar tracking in terms of photosynthesis. So a value of 1 means no effect. A positive value means that solar tracking is increasing photosynthesis, in this case, maybe 5% or thereabouts. And a value less than 1 means that solar tracking is actually decreasing photosynthesis, down here, maybe a couple percent. So we can see that and this is, increasing leaf area. So as the plants develop more leaves, more of the shadows of solar tracking leaves are shading other leaves and reducing photosynthesis. And yet, you can understand why they do it here. Here, it's clearly beneficial. The shadows are just falling on soil, but they're still doing it up here at high leaf area when it's actually reducing the productivity of the community. Why do they do that? Well, the plant that's making this shadow is not this plant. It's another plant, a neighbor, and they're competing with each other for light and for water and for soil nutrients and everything. So shading your neighbor is actually something, unfortunately, that natural selection will increase over evolutionary time, and that's what's happened. But we could fix that. So here's another example. These are tassels. They're the male flowers of maize plants. And so they produce pollen. And collectively, these tassels produce much more pollen than is actually needed by the crop. But they have a cost to the crop because, like solar tracking leaves, they cast shadows. Here you can see a shadow of a tassel. And these tassels used to be actually quite a bit larger than this, 50 years ago, and cast even larger shadows. And so back in 1967, my postdoctoral mentor, the late Bob Loomis, and colleagues calculated how much photosynthesis and crop growth and crop yield are we losing because of this shading of these tassels being too big. And the answer you could see here is up to 30%. Middle of the day, it's less than 10%, but significant losses of photosynthesis from these tassels being too large. These plants have been, evolved for millions of years, and then plant breeders worked with them for hundreds or a few thousand years. And yet this trait has persisted. Why is that? Well, the answer is the same reason that the too large antlers of Irish elk, the bull elk, persisted as this species was going extinct. They're getting their antlers caught in the trees and eaten by wolves, but still the individual bull elk that had large antlers got all the mates and had all the offspring, just as a corn plant that produces more than its share of pollen by having a really large tassel will have more offspring in the next generation, and that trait will persist. So let me just summarize for plants before we move on to symbiosis. Plants that increase their own reproduction increase their abundance over generations. That's how evolution works, even when that's at the expense of the community. And so I've given these two examples of solar tracking, maybe only a small cost there. Tassels being too big, a fairly large cost. And then an example that people may be more familiar with, old varieties of wheat and rice put a lot of energy into growing tall and shading out their neighbors at the expense of making more seeds. And so when Peter Jennings, working with rice, and Norman Borlaug, working with wheat, selected for shorter plants, actually Borlaug used materials originally from Japan, they were able to more or less double grain production by these crops overnight. And there's still opportunities here for making plants more cooperative so that we get more benefit from them. And this 2015 paper, I talk about that in the context of how plants now are wasting soil water, and we could select them to be more cooperative so that we would get more benefit under drought conditions. There are lots of other examples in my book, Darwinian Agriculture. I'll mention that I will at the very end, I will just quickly show the citations for all of these cited references. So those will be in the YouTube. You won't have to guess about the references. Now, these tassels were too big, and plant breeders have actually cut their size by maybe as much as 70%, but it took them 60 years to do this because they weren't really selecting for small tassels. They were just breeding for yield. And so I would like to suggest this is an example of something that a small group of farmers could have done, because figuring out how big a tassel is not something that takes a bunch of expensive equipment. It's something that could really be done on a small scale. And some of the other examples in my book also could be done by small scale projects. So plants compete with each other because plants all use the same resources, but they cooperate with other species which don't compete with them for resources. So for example, ants and plants don't use the same resources. And so some trees actually provide housing to ants in exchange for the ants killing competing trees. This is the devil's garden that are found in South America. Lots of pollination cooperation. An example of wasps pollinate figs in exchange for eating some of the seeds inside the fig fruit. And then my main focus of research is the symbiosis, where microbes give plants resources like phosphorus or nitrogen in exchange for carbon the plants get from photosynthesis. And so this is already a very beneficial form of cooperation, but I'm working to try to make it even more cooperative. And this is something where possibly some community level projects could be helpful. So I'm arguing that crops like beans or clover or alfalfa could get even more nitrogen from root nodule bacteria if it weren't so expensive to the plants to feed those bacteria. I mean, the bacteria are inside these root nodules, and so all of their energy has to come from the plant. And the reaction nitrogen gas here, these are the energy resources that the plant provides in order to get ammonia, and then there's hydrogen produced as a byproduct. Well, this is what should be happening. The plant provides carbon, the bacteria respire it to carbon dioxide, and in the process get energy, ATP, and so on, which they then use to convert nitrogen gas into ammonia, which they give mostly to the plant for the plant to make the proteins that we eat. But these bacteria don't respire all of the carbon. A significant fraction of that carbon they actually divert to their own use. For example, in this lipid called polyhydroxybutyrate, or PHB, which the bacteria can accumulate to on the order of half of their weight in PHB that they're diverting, energy that could have gone to nitrogen fixation, they're diverting to their own use. Well, the bacteria benefit from this. Will Ratcliffe, now a professor at Georgia Tech, compared starvation of low PHB rhizobia, which basically starved to death and died in a few months, versus high PHB rhizobia of the same strain. They could actually reproduce without any outside food, just using the PHB that they got from the plant when they were in symbiosis. And more recently, Catherine Mueller, now working for the Department of Agriculture, took this to the field and looked at a case where the host plants for these bacteria either were present every year like this, or where they hadn't been grown for 30 years, where the bacteria had to survive in the soil for 30 years without having a symbiotic partner. And what she found, consistent with Will Ratcliffe's results, is that the longer these bacteria were in the soil, the more what you might call cheaters were the ones that survived and persisted. These were the ones that, when they'd been in a root nodule, put more of their energy into PHB and less into fixing nitrogen for the plant. Well, so there's clearly a benefit to, at the individual level. I mean, Maria was talking about the individual versus community, and that's the focus of my research. There's clearly a benefit at the individual level to these bacteria from diverting resources from nitrogen fixation to their own use, just like greed can sometimes benefit individual humans. But if they divert too much resource, their plant's not going to have enough nitrogen. It's not going to be able to make the enzymes that it needs to photosynthesize. It won't have carbon to share with these bacteria. So there's a collective cost of these bacteria diverting resources away from nitrogen fixation. And we can see that here on the left. This is a little bit tricky, but it's explained in this paper. The vertical axis here is the efficiency of nitrogen fixation, how much nitrogen the plant is getting from these bacteria relative to how much carbon the plant is spending in the respiration of these root nodules. And this is over time. And the red is the natural strain that you would normally find in the soil. The blue is a strain that was mutated so that it doesn't divert resources away from nitrogen fixation and into its own use. And you can see that it's providing substantially more nitrogen benefit relative to its cost. And that actually shows up in plant growth as well. This was a scientist named Ceballos who actually developed this mutant. And you can see here the natural strain, and here's the mutant strain that's not diverting resources, providing much more nitrogen to the plant. I should say Ryoko Ono is now a professor at UC Santa Barbara. So a lot of my students have become professors. Well, so you've got this individual benefit versus collective benefit. How does natural evolution of rhizobia balance those two? Well, to answer that question, Stuart West, who's now a professor at Oxford, he was not my student. He just spent visited my lab to do this work. And so he asked, what percent of the energy that these rhizobia bacteria get from their host plant should they spend on the nitrogen fixation that benefits the plant as opposed to using it for their own use? And he's asking this not in some, sort of moral, what would be the moral thing to do? Because these are bacteria. He's saying, how much allocation nitrogen fixation is going to make these bacteria most successful over the course of evolution? Now, some other people have done that, but they did it on the assumption that there was only one strain of bacteria on each plant. And so Stuart started with that assumption because this axis here is how related these bacteria are within a plant. So relatedness of one, these bacteria are all, essentially twins or triplets or millioniplets, whatever you would call that. They're all the same genotype. And if there's only one strain there, and if they don't provide the plant with nitrogen, the plant's not going to grow very well. They're not going to get the carbon from the plant. And so especially if there's not very much nitrogen in the soil, they had better put half of their energy into nitrogen fixation. And that actually seems to be a fairly typical amount, what these bacteria actually do. Now, if the soil has some nitrogen from fertilizer or compost or something, then they can get away with diverting more resources into their own reproduction. The plant will still do okay. That's with one strain per plant. But as soon as you go to 2 strains per plant, or relatedness of 2, of a 0.5, of a half, you have what Garrett Hardin called a tragedy of the commons, where, you know, maybe if I don't give the plant nitrogen, maybe the other strain will. The other strain will keep the plant alive. I can just use all the resources for my own reproduction. And so if there's nitrogen in the soil, this model said, don't put anything, don't give anything to the plant, use it all for yourself. And as soon as you get to realistic numbers of strains per plant, like 10, which is a typical value, even in a low nitrogen soil, even though the plant's going to really suffer from these plants not fixing nitrogen, from the selfish standpoint of an individual strain, it's better to put nothing into nitrogen fixation and just hope that maybe the other strains, some of them, will support the plant. So, tragedy of the commons. Well, we looked at these results and said, this can't be right. This can't be right. This has got to be wrong. Because if this were true, then, I mean, this symbiosis is millions of years old. And if this were true, it would have fallen apart in just a few years. The bacteria would have all become cheaters that put all the resources into their own reproduction. The plants would have given up on the symbiosis and found some other way to get their nitrogen. So we know this is wrong. Some assumption that went into this model must have been wrong. And we think, well, maybe the assumption that was wrong was the assumption that the only benefit the bacteria get from providing the plant with nitrogen is this collective benefit that's shared by all the bacteria, whether or not they contributed to that benefit. What if, in addition to that collective benefit, there was an individual benefit? What if the plants are smart enough, hard to be smart without a brain, but what if the plants monitor each of these root nodules, and if a root nodule isn't delivering enough nitrogen, they shut down that nodule in a way that keeps the bacteria inside from reproducing? What would happen then? Well, so Stewart modeled 2 different versions of what we call the sanctions hypothesis. And under both of those versions, whatever relatedness you had among these bacteria, whether you had one strain or many, and whether you had high or low soil nitrogen, the bacteria that put about half of their energy into helping the plant, those were the ones that were most successful over the course of evolution. But this was based on this assumption that the plants, you know, they don't have brains. Can plants without brains somehow tell whether a root nodule is delivering nitrogen? And if they do they have some way to shut down that nodule in a way that, from the plant's point of view, they're no longer wasting resources on less beneficial bacteria? But from the standpoint of longer-term evolution, there'd be a community-level benefit, because shutting down the not-so-good bacteria means that next year you've only got better bacteria in the soil. But can plants do that? Well, to answer that question, we used an atmosphere that didn't have any nitrogen gas. So we basically took bacteria that were pretty good, but we stopped them from fixing nitrogen by putting them in an argon-oxygen atmosphere where there was no nitrogen gas. Now, if the plants just gave resources willy-nilly to everyone, then those bacteria that didn't have nitrogen would have spare energy they could use for their own reproduction. They would reproduce more. But if the plant notices that they're doing that and shuts them down, they would reproduce less. And that's what we found. These gray bars are the bacteria that were not providing nitrogen to the plant. And you can see they all have substantially less reproduction, consistent with the assumption in our revised version of the computer model. And you can actually see this with your own eyes. Here's bacteria that were providing nitrogen to plants. And so the plant kept supporting these root nodules, and the nodules grew, and the bacteria inside reproduced, and eventually some of them were released out into the soil and formed the next generation. Here, at this point, we stopped giving nitrogen gas to these bacteria. They stopped giving nitrogen to the plant. The plant shut them down, and they didn't reproduce anymore. And we saw this in all three species that we've looked at, and people have looked at other species, and other labs have looked at this and found the same thing. But those experiments I just showed you were comparing bacteria that fixed lots of nitrogen with bacteria that fixed only enough nitrogen for their own needs, didn't give anything to the plant. And our computer model suggested that what you ought to see in the soil is, given sanctions, is quite a few kind of mediocre bacteria that produce some nitrogen, but not as much as they could. And so to look at that, Toby Keers, now a professor in Amsterdam, used different amounts of nitrogen gas to get different rates of nitrogen fixation. And again, she counted the number of rhizobia per nodule as a measure of evolutionary Darwinian fitness. And consistent with the previous slide, if the bacteria provided lots of nitrogen, they got to reproduce a lot. If they didn't provide any nitrogen, they only got to reproduce about a third as much. If they provided just a tiny amount, maybe a little more reproduction. But if they put half of their energy into nitrogen fixation rather than 100%, well, this isn't 100% because they're still making ATP, but if they put half as much energy into nitrogen fixation as this full, control, so to speak, the one soybean genotype that she looked at didn't notice, didn't shut down. I think maybe one nodule in 6 got shut down. And so they could divert lots of energy into their own reproduction and still get away with it because the plant was tolerating this low-level cheating, if you will. Now, what does this mean in practical terms to try to increase food security in places where farmers don't have easy access to fertilizer and want to rely on symbiosis for the nitrogen that their crops need to make the protein that they depend on? Well, here we see lots of bacteria that are only providing half as much nitrogen as they could relative to their cost. If we could increase the fraction of root nodules that are occupied by these high performance rhizobia, we could potentially get twice as much nitrogen at the same cost to the plant. Now, is there some way that we could do that? And would it take a lot of, genetic engineering? Would it take a lot of fancy, expensive equipment? No, I don't think so. I think this could be done by a small scale, community level project. And here's how you could do it. So this first row, I'm showing these in pots, but they could be in field soil as long as you don't plow too much and mix up the soil. So this first row here is a bunch of different bean varieties, perhaps heirloom varieties that some community might have that hadn't been bred too much by plant breeders. And you grow them up. Don't put on any nitrogen fertilizer. See how they grow. Save the seeds, but don't decide just from this first year which of these varieties is best, because you also want to look at something that evolution doesn't look at, and that is benefits to future generations. So if you're growing beans in rotation with maize, go into that field the next growing season and grow just one variety of maize. So these maize plants are all the same genotype, but this one and this one are growing better because of something that this bean plant and this bean plant did the previous year. Now, what could that be? That could be, we know from work by Nancy Johnson that bean plants have an effect on the beneficial mycorrhizal fungi that maize plants depend on. So maybe this heirloom bean variety and this one were particularly good at enriching the soil with the most beneficial strains of mycorrhizal fungi. Or maybe these bean plants, when their roots went deep into the soil and then eventually decayed, they left channels down through that soil that made it easier for these corn plants to get deep in the soil and get, avoid drought. Anyway, some kind of a legacy effect. And then the next year, go in with a single test genotype of bean. And here, even though they're all the same genotype, this bean is growing better because 2 years ago, this bean plant only let the very best indigenous local strains of rhizobia reproduce in its root nodules and release them into the soil. And based on Catherine Mueller's work, 2 years later, they're still there and benefiting this subsequent crop. So there's a lot of other things I could talk about, but I think probably the questions will be more useful. So I'll just put my summary back up again. Plants compete with each other. That reduces community benefits, but we could actually, we have selected and we can select for more cooperative crop plants in ways that will benefit us all. And a lot of that could be a very low tech sort of thing. Symbiotic microbes can substitute for fertilizers. They're doing fairly well now, but I think we could actually get as much as twice as much, double the benefit from those if we had plants that were more selective in only allowing reproduction of the very best local indigenous strains. You notice I'm not talking about inoculum here. I'm talking about selecting among the indigenous strains. Here are our references. My book has a bunch of ideas about this, and there's a very nice book by Caro Deppi called Breed Your Own Vegetable Varieties that a small scale project could use for some of the nuts and bolts about how you might go about this breeding project. And I'll just zip through so that my references will be in the YouTube thing, and then I can stop sharing and we can have our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation, very rich. And we remind everyone that you are all welcome to leave comments and questions in the YouTube chat. And to continue our session, I would like to introduce our first discussant, EOF participant for the session today. His name is Bernat Celares. He's professor and general manager of the Faculty of Philosophy in the Ramon Llull University, and he's also part of the Business and Peace Village. Bernat.
Thank you, Maria Virginia. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Denison. I have a lot of things on my mind because as long as you were talking about all this, economic things came to my mind. Because, for example, when you were talking about how the plants grow and the leaves make shadow to other leaves, I was thinking, for example, about the economies of scale. It is something that economists theorize about that. How, for example, to find the proper dimension of a company. And this is something that the economists like Alfred Marshall theorized a lot of that. The first reflection, today we have in our societies the conviction that the economy is something that should grow ad infinitum, right? Because, for example, the prime ministers are convinced that the GDP should grow year by year. So that's something that it's contrary to this vegetal world, no, that you've been talking about. So that's the first reflection that I want you to just well, to give us your opinion about this this obsession of economists that the economy should grow, no, year by year. And then a very short question, and this is for me, for a person that knows very less about all this vegetal kingdom. When we go to nature, right, we just get overwhelmed about the richness and the beauty of nature. And actually, no, the Greeks called it cosmos, right? This is something that refers to the order. Everything seems ordered. This is the contrary of chaos, right? Cosmos is the contrary of chaos. So the question is very simple. You showed us some examples about cooperation and some examples like parasites, no, or plants that compete with others and kill the tree, for example. But from your perspective and from your knowledge, if you take this this outlook, no, and see the nature as a whole, what do you think? We do have a reference in nature of cooperation, or we have more depredatory and violent attitudes?
So your first question about growth, certainly we can't keep using, you know, more and more oil and phosphorus and so on. Whether it's possible to have human welfare increase without using more resources, I think is an important question. One challenge that we're facing today, just in terms of food, the world population is continuing to grow, and food production is not growing fast enough to keep up with population growth, and also the other things that are happening, like food being diverted into ethanol and things like that. So, you know, the agronomists that I work with are really worried whether we're going to be able to keep feeding world population. It's not just a matter of population growth. There's also, you know, erosion, degradation of land, and all sorts of other problems. So we're quite worried. But your general question, no, I don't. You know, economies cannot keep growing the way they have been indefinitely. That's certainly true. And population can't keep growing the way it has been indefinitely. In terms of whether nature is harsh or cooperative, I have to say mostly harsh. The most abundant lifestyle in nature is parasitism. And I'm not talking about, I mean, I you know, you could call a strangler fig a parasite if you like, but I wasn't really thinking of that. But really, it's, you know, the things that live on the bodies of other animals and take their resources from them, or that live on plants and take resources from them. We have plants that actually suck into other plants and take out their nutrients. And the reason that cooperation is so rare in nature is really the problem that computer model showed. In other words, almost anything. Let's take two plants, for example. Two plants could probably benefit from cooperating, because maybe one of them is in the sun and one of them has more soil water. If there's some way that they could trade resources, trade water for carbon without cheating, they could both benefit. But they don't know how to do that. They figured out how to do it with rhizobia. They figured out how to do it with fig wasps. They figured out how to do it with mycorrhizal fungi. And there are claims about plants benefiting other plants through mycorrhizal fungi. Those claims are false. And if people are interested, I actually have slides on that. But basically what happens there is the plant does give carbon to the fungus, which it has to do in order to get phosphorus from the fungus. And in early studies, people looked at other plants nearby and said, oh, look, some of that carbon the plant is giving is going to those other plants. Isn't that other plant nice? Well, first of all, if anybody's being nice, it's the fungus, because that's the one that has the carbon. But Phil Pfeffer actually analyzed what form that carbon is in the roots of the beneficiary plant. And it's all in chemicals that are only made by fungi. So it's on the roots, but it's not in the plant. Maybe a little tiny amount of carbon is going to the plant, but somebody may talk about this system. So I just thought I should tell you that it is not true that plants are benefiting each other through the mycorrhizal fungi, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. So just very briefly, sorry. I guess it's quite adventurous, no, to say something about that, but I guess that we are part of nature. So assuming your position, we should think that we are more, there is more parasitism than cooperation, okay? Just this is my assumption. But what do you think it could make the difference in the human kingdom?
More cooperation? Yes, we need more cooperation. I wish you success. And you know, basically what I proposed in this was humans imposing selection on plants and bacteria to make them more cooperative. Now, the plants are already doing that to some extent. They're already imposing selection for cooperation on the bacteria. So we could, you know, if you're looking for a model, you know, that's the model. Don't just hope that cooperation will happen. You have to have some kind of, if you want individuals to cooperate, they have to benefit from cooperation. I think that's what plants are telling us. Now, that may not be true for humans, because we have morality, right? We can cooperate in cases where we don't benefit from cooperation. But if you listen to plants, that's what they're saying, is if you want cooperation, everyone has to benefit from it individually.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we can do it spiritually, no?
Right,
but then
exactly.
When
plants
you
don't have that.
Yeah, exactly. But then I think there's an interesting thing. You called it sanctions, no? Plants make sanctions, natural sanctions, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking that this word economy comes from oikonomos in Greek, which means the administrator. And this nomos is the laws. It's the law. It's the norm that how we organize this oikos, this house. No, so I think that we have the spirituality, but also this political part of the reality. No, which is to put laws that could increase or could create this cooperation. No?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bernard.
Sorry.
The discussion that is super interesting, but I would like to give the floor to our second discussion for today. She's Caterina Rondoni. She's a PhD student in environmental sustainability and well-being from the University of Ferrara, and she's also part of the Agriculture and Justice Village. Kate.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, Professor, for your amazing presentation. And my question is really like linked to what we are discussing like till now. So, but I would like to focus a bit more on symbiosis. And I always found it extremely interesting how nature pushes different species to create this bound of interdependency and mutual help. However, what I would like to discuss with you goes a little beyond the biological aspect of symbiosis, and it's more of a terminological discourse connected with the work we are trying to do as Economia Francesco, and in particular in our village, Agriculture and Justice. And from the point of view of systemic change and economic paradigm shift, it will be interesting to understand the differences between a symbiotic relationship and a relation of cooperation and collaboration. And if human and nature can be considered more in a symbiotic or collaborative relationship. And also really linked to what you were discussing is, from this point of view, with the goal of improving the food system, for example, what could be the role of nature and which one the role of the humans, and how these two roles are connected? That it, in part you already answered, but I would like to like underline more this aspect. Thank you.
Yeah. So many scientists use symbiosis for any kind of a close long-term interaction, whether or not it's beneficial. So parasitism would be an example of symbiosis. And I focus on the mutualistic symbioses, which are the ones that are beneficial to both sides. Yeah, so I've given other talks with titles like where does nature's wisdom lie? And that's actually a pun, because sometimes what seems to be wisdom in nature may actually be a lie, an untruth. And so I'm very interested in the idea of looking to nature for ways to improve agriculture in particular. And the distinction I've made is between aspects of nature where we can be fairly confident there's been continuous improvement over millions of years, versus aspects of nature where we don't really have a good reason to think it's been consistently improved. And so I've argued in some detail that the only thing in nature that reliably improves anything is the force of natural selection in evolution. And so if that's true, then we ought to see in what we call the adaptations of wild plants and wild animals, all sorts of really great ideas that we might be able to use for improving agriculture, but possibly also for improving, say, industrial processes, like making a better valve or something like that. And that contrasts with ecosystems where they have not been consistently improved by evolutionary processes. So, close to my home is the headwaters of the Mississippi River, which is a lake. And in that lake is wild rice. And wild rice grows naturally as a monoculture, just one species. Why is that? Is that because monoculture is better? Well, no. You haven't had lakes competing with other lakes, some with many species and some with one species, and lakes don't reproduce the way wild rice plants do. So they haven't been improved. And so maybe wild rice would do better in intercropping as some kind of a mixed system. Let me give another. Well, I have another example, but do you want to ask another question? Okay, so here's an example I like. You've got, we know that we need more diversity of crops in agriculture. That's very important to preventing disease outbreaks and that sort of thing. But if you look at a particular farm or a particular region, there are different ways that you could use that diversity. So you could, for example, grow corn and beans together. That would have some benefits. But then what do you do next year? You've already used corn and beans, so you grow corn and beans together again. And so any diseases that might be building up in the soil are building up for both corn and beans. So an alternative approach is rotation, where you grow corn one year, you grow beans the next year, and your corn diseases are dying out while the beans are growing. Well, it turns out a 2-year rotation probably isn't long enough, but that's another issue. And I've suggested we should think about really weird ideas that so that's anyway, but you don't see crop rotation in nature. You don't see pines this year and oaks next year. But because forests haven't been optimized, just trees have been optimized, the fact that we don't see it in rotation doesn't mean it's not a good idea. Oh, but wait, you do see crop rotation in nature on an individual basis. And that is the phenomenon called masting, where a number of tree species produce lots of seeds in 1 year, more seeds than the, squirrels can all eat. And then the next year they produce very few seeds. And so the squirrels don't reproduce as much. And so they keep the squirrel population down. Now, this is a community level benefit of keeping the squirrel population down, but it's selected by individual benefit. Because if you as a tree don't fall in with that pattern, then you're producing nuts in the year when there's lots of squirrels. Okay, so I think this maybe is an example where natural selection evolution is telling us that crop rotation is a good idea.
So sorry, I jumped for 1 second. So what do you suggest is our role as human beings, like helping nature to pursue like the sustainable way to produce?
Well, it's a really big question, obviously. We need to, I'm not entirely sure about some of the ecosystem services claims, but we certainly need to preserve some wild nature as a source of good ideas for improving agriculture and for improving other things. And we need to take a long-term view, and we need to take what you're advocating, a longer-term view and a more collective cooperative view. So for example, it may not be profitable for one farmer to grow some, maybe for one farmer, it's more profitable to just grow corn and soybeans the same as everybody else. But if everybody grows corn and soybeans and we get a big disease of corn or soybeans, then we don't have any food. So we have to think about the community, not just the individual.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And I think that with this, like, we are running out of time. But thank you everyone for the comments and the questions that we will be sharing with the professor after the session. We would like to remind everyone that this is a path towards our global event that is happening in September, and the registrations are open until March 31st. So we invite you to register. And we thank you, everyone. We are like super grateful for this journey that we are walking together. And yeah, we hope to see you soon. Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you very much, Bernat and Kathy and Paul.
Thanks. Are we finished, or was there some final conclusions?
Actually, I think